Hey guys, Zach here, and today I want to talk to you guys about the 4 tanks that you see in front of you. Now today with these 4 tanks, I want to talk to you guys about something that has bothered me for a little while with aquariums, and I'm sure you guys have run into this same problem as well. And that is going to be the difference in cycling that every tank seems to exhibit. Now all of the tanks that you see in front of you have been set up for roughly the same amount of time. Obviously there's a little bit of a gap, but everyone that's beside each other is within a week of each other. So I think I set that one up first, and then that one, and then that one, and then that one. So they're all very similar in age, but as you can see, they all look very, very different. So I just want to cover what I think some of the small differences are that can really change the way that a tank cycles. The first 2 tanks that I want to talk about today are these 2 in front of you. This is my Ecosystem Forest Mini, and this is a Ecosystem Sphere. And even though they look very similar, they're very different, and one of them is a week older than the other, but you probably can't tell because this one looks like it's grown in much more than this one has, but this one is actually the older tank, believe it or not. And obviously there are a couple of key differences between the 2. The first difference that I would like to point out is going to be the substrate depth. This tank has a much deeper substrate layer than this tank, and I believe that access to nutrients has affected any of the plants planted in it and their overall health, as well as their access to the nutrients that they do need. The reason why I've brought up depth of substrate is because it is super important for the nitrogen cycle in your tank to have substrate that is the right depth. That is because with substrate that is too thin, you're not going to get as much anaerobic bacteria, which is bacteria that grows in the lack of oxygen. So deep inside the substrate layer is where the bacteria likes to grow and thrive. And in this tank, I just think there's not enough layer of substrate to create a large area for that anaerobic bacteria to colonize, which means there's probably some in here, but it's just down at the very bottom, and it just doesn't have that much space to grow and expand the colony. Whereas with this tank beside it, you can see this is a very deep substrate layer, almost double the depth of this one, which means there's just more possibility for a greater colony of anaerobic bacteria to form over here, which I think is very, very important for the health of a tank. When looking at substrate in cycling tanks, it's also very important to look at the type of substrate that you have, as that can even lead to differences in how fast the tank cycles or what the cycle looks like with the tank. On the left here, I've got a tank that's got sand, capping it off with nutrients underneath, and then this one, again, just open aqua soil, and these 2 tanks cycled very, very differently. Now, the reason why I think these 2 tanks cycled very differently is even though they are similar in size, with this difference in substrate, there is a change in available nutrients in the water column. So what I mean by that is with the sand over here, I'm locking down all the nutrients down here, so the plants have to dig deep into the substrate to get to those nutrients that there is topsoil underneath. Whereas with this, it's much more available, and any of the shrimp or snails that swim around in here can stir up the substrate, which can even put nutrients into the water column, which I think has greatly contributed to the growth of the floating plants at the top, which is just frog bit. Something else I would like to touch on is during the cycling process, sometimes you can run into growth of algae because your plants are not fully developed yet and they just can't outcompete the algae. Something important to consider is with that substrate, this sand and this big rock create very, very good surfaces for algae to grow on, and if I keep my lighting too high, I know that algae is just going to absolutely take over this tank. Whereas with this one, I knew that lighting wouldn't be too big of an issue, it wouldn't reflect too much. However, because of the topsoil, all of that available nutrient content that can be in the water could also contribute to algae growing. So keep that in mind when you do decide to cycle a tank. With lighting being top of mind, it's also very important to mention that all of these tanks actually have different lighting, which can contribute to differences in growth. While I do like to keep my lights on, I don't want algae to grow and take over. So this tank actually doesn't get any lighting, and I open the window behind it, which gives it all of the lighting that it does need. And as you can see, it has kept the tank from growing tons and tons of algae, and it's kept the rock relatively clean, and the shrimp that are in here are able to keep up with the algae that does develop while the plants grow and slowly start to outcompete the algae. Now, this tank in the middle gets the most lighting, but it also has the densest amount of plant life in it, as well as having a lot of Rotala, which you can see on the side. And because of the high lighting, the Rotala has turned a nice bright red, which is really great to see, and I will most likely keep up the high lighting. Now this one is sort of a middle ground between the two. It doesn't have crazy high lighting, but it does have just enough lighting to keep all of these plants going. Obviously for the video, I've lit it up a lot more than I normally do have it. And as you can see, there is not a speck of algae in that tank. Now, something else I want to talk about in this video when you are considering the cycling of your tank is going to be the top opening of your tank. You can see that this one bottlenecks down and it's pretty skinny, as well as this one, it's pretty skinny, but then my circular orb tank over here has a nice large opening. What this means is that this tank is going to have the highest rate of gas exchange compared to the other two that I showed you, and this one will have a slightly lower rate than the orb, but it's going to be pretty high, and this one is going to actually have the least amount of gas exchange. Now, the reason why it's very important to look at the opening of your tank and the gas exchange rate, even when you're starting up a tank and it might be cycling, is because that is going to affect the overall plant health. Nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, all of that gets into the water through the atmosphere and diffuses through that top of the water and then into your tank, into your plants. And it's very tricky when you have something like this tank, which has a very skinny opening at the top, but then opens up on the inside. Not enough CO2 is getting into there, and not enough nitrogen is getting into there to really help properly feed these plants. And as you can see, the tank is not looking the best, so you have to come up with different solutions in order to fix that. Now, there are a couple of ways to increase the gas exchange in your tank. The first way would be creating more surface area of water for the gas to exchange, but that's just not realistic. The second way is to increase surface agitation, which is very easy to do with a filter. So something like this tank would definitely benefit from having a filter, and I will most likely put one on. Or you could even use something like an air stone, which creates bubbles at the top, which is surface agitation, which brings in all of those gases to the water. Another way to bring more gases into your water is just by adding something like a CO2 diffuser or adding in liquid CO2, which just puts the gas right in the water right away, skipping the surface agitation. However, I would definitely recommend starting with something like a filter and seeing if that does perk up your plants if you are suffering from something like this. With all of that in mind, just a regular normal shaped tank is going to have a lot of gas exchange and it generally won't be a problem. However, if you do get something like a tall tank, it's something that you do want to think about and consider when you are planting, because plants that are too low are going to suffer from a lack of something like CO2, as it won't properly diffuse and it'll get harder and harder for it to get down to the bottom. With all of that considered, something else you want to think about when cycling a tank is going to be any immersed growth. Now, this can be plants like your stem plants coming up out the back, but even stuff like floating plants like this frog bit here count as immersed growth. You could even take terrestrial plants like a fern, for example, and just put the roots into the water, and that is immersed growth, and it greatly benefits the tank. Now, the reason for this is because these plants now have access to atmospheric CO2, which, as we just learned, is far more abundant in the atmosphere than it is in the water, which is going to basically super boost its growth. The reason why the atmospheric CO2 basically super boosts the plants is because of photosynthesis. The process of photosynthesis is very complex, but simplified, you take carbon dioxide, CO2, and water, H2O, the plant takes it in, you add some light, and it produces a sugar as well as oxygen. It doesn't need the oxygen, but it uses the sugar to grow, and that's how it produces its food. Now, considering that in an aquarium, you're generally going to be limited by your CO2, which means that once these aquatic plants have access to the atmosphere and there is an abundant amount of CO2 comparatively, they are able to take all that in, and CO2 is no longer the limiting factor, which means they can start to grow at a much faster pace. Now, the reason why I've shared this all with you today is because I was just thinking about it as I was watching all of these tanks mature and grow, just how differently they've each cycled, and I figured that you guys out there have probably had this same problem. You've set up tanks almost exactly the same, but then they cycle completely different, and it is quite frustrating that you think you're improving and then all of a sudden you take a step back and you see that something in the cycling process maybe goes wrong, maybe it's just different, and it really confuses you and you just reach out but you just can't figure it out. I've definitely run into that in the past, and I've just collected thoughts over the last couple of weeks and tried to put them into a video to make them a little more coherent, but these are just things that I think you guys should know and consider when you do cycle a tank. So guys, that is everything for that video. Hopefully the information in this video is a little bit of help to you. If you have enjoyed, please consider subscribing, and I will see you guys next time. Peace.